Throughout the pages of the Bible lies a mystery that has fascinated scholars and sparked debate for centuries. The story of the Nephilim.
I move without legs and I am heard without a voice.
These enigmatic beings, often described as giants, warriors of unmatched strength, or figures of legendary fame, make their first appearance in Genesis 6. According to the text, they were born from an otherworldly union between human women and the sons of God, a phrase frequently interpreted as fallen angels. But there's a twist in the tale. The Great Flood, meant to wipe out all life except for Noah and his family, should have marked the end of the Nephilim. Yet, intriguingly, these beings appear again in the post-flood narrative. How could this be? Did they somehow survive, or did their lineage begin anew? The mystery of their persistence has left theologians grappling with unanswered questions for generations. Join us as we delve into the ancient texts, explore biblical clues, and examine some of the most compelling theories behind the origin and reappearance of the mysterious Nephilim. What were the Nephilim? The Bible introduces the Nephilim in a brief but fascinating passage from Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men and had children by them. These were the heroes of old, men of renown. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root nephal, which can mean fallen ones or those who fall upon, often interpreted to describe their destructive nature or their fall from grace. In some translations, they're referred to as giants, while others describe them as mighty warriors or legendary figures known for their great strength and influence. Before the flood, they were seen as a corrupting force on earth. According to Genesis, these beings were born from the union between fallen angels and human women, a serious violation of God's boundaries. Their presence contributed to the world's moral collapse, which ultimately led to God's decision to cleanse the earth through the flood. Genesis makes it very clear that the flood wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a divine act of judgment meant to reset humanity. In Genesis 7:21-23, the Bible describes the total destruction caused by the flood. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished: birds, livestock, wild animals, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. According to this passage, the flood was absolute. Everything and everyone outside the ark was wiped out, including the Nephilim. But fast forward a few hundred years, and the story takes a surprising turn. The Nephilim reappear in the land of Canaan. After the flood, the Israelites set out to claim the land God had promised them, Canaan. But when Moses sent 12 spies to scout out the land, they returned with an alarming report. In Numbers 13:32-33, the spies said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This passage reveals that the Nephilim, or at least their descendants, were still around after the flood. The spies described entire tribes of giants, specifically the Anakim, who were believed to be linked to the Nephilim. These giants were so enormous that the Israelites felt small and powerless in comparison. So, how did the Nephilim return if they were supposedly wiped out in the flood? Let's explore 3 possible explanations. One possibility is that fallen angels, the same ones who fathered the Nephilim before the flood, could have returned to corrupt humanity again after the flood waters receded. While the book of Genesis doesn't specifically mention this happening, some scholars believe it's plausible based on other biblical passages. For example, Jude 1:6 describes rebellious angels who abandoned their heavenly positions and crossed into forbidden territory. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Supporters of this theory argue that while some of these angels were bound in chains as punishment for their sins, the Bible doesn't say that all of them were. It's possible that other fallen angels escaped punishment and continued their rebellion, once again fathering a new generation of Nephilim after the flood. This theory also aligns with the idea that spiritual corruption didn't end with the flood. Humanity's heart remained sinful, and the spiritual forces of evil continued their attempts to disrupt God's plan for redemption. However, this theory raises some questions. If God destroyed the earth to wipe out this wickedness, why would he allow it to happen again? Could it be that this ongoing battle between good and evil is part of a larger cosmic spiritual war that will continue until the end of time? Theory 2. The Nephilim bloodline survived through Noah's family. Another theory suggests that the Nephilim gene may have survived the flood through Noah's family. Not through Noah himself, but possibly through his sons' wives. The Bible describes Noah as righteous and blameless in his generation, Genesis 6:9, but it doesn't provide much detail about the background of his sons' wives. Some scholars speculate that one of these women may have carried Nephilim DNA, which could explain the reappearance of giants after the flood. This theory is supported by the fact that certain tribes of giants were later associated with the descendants of Ham, one of Noah's sons. For example, the Anakim, a race of giants that the Israelites encountered in Canaan, were believed to be descendants of Anak, who came from the line of Ham. If this theory is true, it means that the Nephilim bloodline never completely disappeared. Instead, it was passed down through human generations, resurfacing in certain tribes and regions after the flood. This idea also ties into the biblical theme of generational sin, the concept that the consequences of sin can be passed down from one generation to the next. However, some critics of this theory point out that it's speculative. The Bible doesn't explicitly say that Nephilim DNA survived through Noah's family, but it's an interesting possibility that helps explain the presence of giants in post-flood narratives. Theory 3. The Nephilim were not literal giants, but symbolic figures. A third theory takes a more symbolic approach and suggests that the Nephilim weren't necessarily physical giants, but rather spiritual giants, meaning powerful rulers, tyrants, and warriors who gained a reputation for their influence and oppression. In this interpretation, the term Nephilim could refer to corrupt leaders or mighty men of renown who ruled through fear, violence, and domination. These men were giants in the sense that they held immense power and influenced entire nations. Supporters of this theory argue that the Bible's use of the term men of renown in Genesis 6 suggests that the Nephilim were famous for their deeds and influence, not necessarily for their size. This symbolic view also fits with the broader biblical theme of spiritual warfare. Throughout history, humanity has been plagued by oppressive rulers and corrupt systems that lead people away from God. The Nephilim, in this sense, could represent human rebellion and sin on a grand scale. While this theory moves away from the idea of literal giants, it helps explain why the Bible continues to refer to the Nephilim long after the flood. It suggests that the term could be more about spiritual influence than physical stature. The Bible never fully explains how the Nephilim reappeared after the flood, leaving us with an open-ended mystery. However, what we do know is that their presence is mentioned both before and after the flood. which shows that their influence didn't vanish with the floodwaters. Some scholars believe that the Bible intentionally leaves certain details out, focusing instead on spiritual truths rather than answering every historical question. John 21:25 highlights this idea when it says, "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." The purpose of the Bible isn't to satisfy every curiosity about ancient history, but to point us toward God's plan of redemption through Jesus Christ. The mystery of the Nephilim has sparked a lot of interest in modern times. Some authors and theologians have written extensively on the subject, exploring how these ancient beings may play a role in end-time prophecy. At the heart of the Nephilim mystery is a reminder that spiritual warfare is real. Whether the Nephilim were literal giants, corrupted rulers, or spiritual symbols of rebellion, their story highlights the ongoing battle between God's kingdom and forces of darkness. While we may never know exactly how the Nephilim returned after the flood, their story reminds us that humanity's struggle with sin and rebellion is an ancient one. And through it all, God's sovereignty remains unchanged. In the end, one thing is clear. No power, human or spiritual, can stand against God's ultimate plan for redemption. Besides Nephilim, when people think of giants in the Bible, Goliath is usually the first name that comes to mind. He's the towering Philistine warrior who taunted Israel's army, only to be brought down by a young shepherd named David, armed with nothing more than a sling and a stone. But Goliath wasn't the only giant mentioned after the flood. The Bible also tells the story of King Og of Bashan, a ruler described as one of the last survivors of an ancient race of giants known as the Rephaim. His size and strength were legendary, making him a formidable figure in Israel's history. In Deuteronomy 3, we're given a fascinating detail about King Og that highlights just how enormous he was: his bed. The text says, "For only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit." Let's put that into perspective. A cubit was an ancient unit of measurement based on the length of a forearm, roughly 18 inches, or 45 centimeters. Based on this, Og's bed was about 13.5 feet long, over 4 meters, and 6 feet wide, almost 2 meters. This wasn't just a bed. It was a massive piece of iron built to accommodate a man of extraordinary size. If his bed was proportionate to his body, King Og himself could have been around 11 to 12 feet tall. The inclusion of such a detail in the Bible isn't random. It serves to emphasize just how intimidating and powerful this man was. Imagine facing someone more than twice your height in battle, especially during a time when most people were far shorter than today's average height. Og wasn't just a king, he was a giant of a man, both literally and symbolically. Og's story is significant, not just because of his size, but because of what he represented. He was part of a group called the Rephaim, a mysterious race of giants that existed after the flood. The Bible describes them as powerful warriors who lived in the lands surrounding Canaan, the very land God promised to give to the Israelites. When the Israelites were preparing to enter the Promised Land, they encountered several giant tribes. These encounters terrified many of them. In Numbers 13, the spies sent to scout out the land returned with a fearful report. "The land we explored devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The giants in Canaan weren't just myths or exaggerations. The Israelites genuinely feared these people because of their massive size and strength. Og was one of the last known leaders of these giant clans, and his defeat marked an important victory for the Israelites. Of course, the most famous giant of all is Goliath, the Philistine warrior who challenged Israel's army. Goliath is described as standing over 9 feet tall, about 2.7 meters, and covered in heavy armor from head to toe. His weaponry alone was intimidating: a bronze helmet, a massive spear, and a shield so large it required someone to carry it in front of him. For 40 days, Goliath stood before the Israelite army, mocking them and daring anyone to face him in battle. No one dared until David stepped forward. David wasn't a soldier. He was a shepherd, the youngest of his brothers, and armed with nothing more than a sling and 5 stones. But David had something far more powerful: faith in God. As he approached Goliath, David famously declared, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." With one well-aimed stone, David struck Goliath on the forehead, and the giant fell. It's one of the most well-known stories in the Bible, often used to symbolize how faith and courage can overcome even the greatest obstacles. The giants in the Bible, whether it's Goliath, King Og, or the other Rephaim tribes, represent more than just large people. They symbolize obstacles, rebellion, and the spiritual forces that stand in opposition to God's plan. Throughout biblical history, giants are often associated with enemy nations or corrupt rulers who try to prevent God's people from fulfilling His promises. But over and over again, we see the same pattern. No giant is too big for God to defeat. King Og may have ruled over a vast territory, but his kingdom fell. Goliath may have towered over David, but he was brought down with a single stone. The message is clear. No matter how great or powerful the enemy seems, God's power is greater. The stories of giants in the Bible aren't just about ancient history. They remind us of spiritual truths that still apply today. We all face giants in our lives, obstacles, fears, or challenges that seem overwhelming. These giants may take the form of difficult circumstances, toxic relationships, or even inner struggles like doubt and fear. But just like David, we're called to face them with faith in God's strength rather than our own. The Bible's message is clear. God is greater than any giant. He's greater than fear, greater than opposition, and greater than any force that tries to stand in the way of His plan. Whether it's a towering warrior on the battlefield or a giant king ruling over a distant land, these stories remind us that no enemy is too great for God to overcome. Just as He delivered David and the Israelites from their giants, He can deliver us from ours too. In the end, the giants of the Bible are more than just ancient figures. They're powerful reminders that faith, courage, and trust in God will always lead to victory.